Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab, all on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon to everyone and welcome to CSIS. We're lucky today to have Commissioner Brendan Carr along with my colleagues Dean Chong and Nuri Turkey who will speak on the issue of securing America's networks against Chinese security threats. This is something that all of us have been working on for a long time. There's many issues, as you know. The run of show today is that Commissioner Carr will make some opening remarks, and then Dean and Nuri will follow. I'll give brief intros. Their full bios are available on our websites, but Commissioner Brendan Carr is the senior Republican on the FCC, and he was previously the agency's general counsel. He's led its work to modernize infrastructure rules and accelerate the build out of high-speed networks, a crucial area for competition. He's also done a lot on expanding the skilled workforce we'll need for future networks. He brings years of experience in the private and public sectors in communications and tech policy. So we're lucky to have him here today. He'll be followed by Dean Chong, an old friend from the Heritage Foundation, who has been doing research on China's political and security affairs for as long as I've known him, which is a long time. He specializes in China's military and foreign policy, and in particular, the relationship with the United States and the rest of Asia. Dean's written extensively on China's military doctrine and technology policies. He previously worked at SAIC, the Center for Naval Analysis, which is an FFRDC. And prior to that, I didn't know this, at the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment. So there's a real blast from the past. Finally, we're lucky to have Nuri Turkey, who's a lawyer, foreign policy expert, and human rights advocate. In May 2020, he was appointed as a commissioner to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. He's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. Nuri serves as the chairman of the board for the Uyghur Human Rights Project. So again, a new perspective to this, and I think this will be a good discussion. The format is pretty straightforward. We'll open with Commissioner Carr. So if you're ready, please go ahead.
Great. Well, thank you so much to you, James, and to CSIS for hosting this event and inviting me to speak. Great to be joined by these distinguished panelists. And after I give a couple remarks, I'm happy to join with them and take some questions as well. What I'm going to lay out here today are two additional steps that I think the FCC should take to ensure the security of our communications networks against the threats posed by communist China, and also some targeted action that we should take at the FCC to address the genocide that's taking place in Xinjiang right now. And to help put this in context, I'll start 2 years ago. I had the privilege of visiting Malmstrom Air Force Base, which is all the way up near Great Falls, Montana. And I spent time there with Colonel Jennifer Reeves, and she's the commander of the 341st Missile Wing. Colonel Reeves and her team have one of the most significant and weighty missions in government. In their charge are 150 intercontinental ballistic missiles loaded in underground silos spread across northern Montana. These are missiles that, when launched, can carry warheads almost 10,000 miles. Colonel Reeves told me that her job is to make sure that they're always ready to go. Now, set against that destructive power is a completely serene and wide open landscapes. It's just wheat fields in big sky country, except for one thing. There are cell towers all around those Montana missile fields that have been running on Huawei equipment. Now, this is not just a concern for the military. Everything that we do in modern society now runs on interconnected networks, from banking to transportation, even our power grids. And this will become only more so as we continue to see 5G networks spread out across the country. If these networks are threatened, everything that we have come to rely on is threatened. Now, we've acknowledged the threat posed by telecom equipment vendors with ties to Communist China going back as far as 2012. That's when a House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence issued a report recommending that companies avoid using Huawei, ZTE, because of the threats that are posed, and that government agencies themselves should remain vigilant and focused on that threat. And I would say over the past 3 to 4 years, we have really turned the page in this country, in the US, on the weak and timid approach that we took to Communist China in the past. And frankly, that was a bipartisan failing. And we now have a bipartisan commitment, from my perspective, to show the strength and the resolve needed to address Communist China's threat. We've been doing our part at the FCC. A couple years ago, we launched a proceeding to take a look at Huawei, ZTE, and other carriers with ties to Communist China. And we started proceedings to make sure that carriers in the US that receive federal dollars, universal service funds, are not using those funds to put insecure Huawei or ZTE gear into their networks. I also call for the FCC to do a top to bottom review of every carrier that has a 214 authorization, which is an FCC authorization to operate a communications line here, and look at them to see if they have ties to Communist China. We've now moved forward with that proposal. We have a number of carriers that we're looking at proposing to revoke their authorizations. Now, when we adopted these rules that require telecom carriers to remove and replace equipment that pose an unacceptable national security risk, that was an important step, and it made substantial progress in terms of securing US national security. But the rules that the FCC adopted only apply to equipment, as I noted, that are purchased with federal funding, again, known as the Universal Service Fund. The FCC rules expressly allow carriers to use private funds to purchase and use that exact same equipment. So in my view, it is time that we close this glaring loophole. Once we've determined that Huawei or any other gear poses an unacceptable national security risk, it makes no sense to allow that exact same equipment to get purchased and inserted into our communications network as long as federal dollars aren't involved. It's the presence of this insecure gear in our networks that's the threat, not the source of funding used to purchase them. Yet, if you look back at the FCC's equipment authorization regime, we continue to review and approve, give our stamp of approval to thousands of applications from Huawei and other entities that we've deemed national security risks. So what I'm calling for is for the FCC to move swiftly to eliminate Communist China's backdoor into our networks. And I think doing this is going to be consistent with decisions made on a bipartisan basis in the Secure Network Act of 2019. Again, we have this equipment authorization process that disallows any device from being marketed, sold, or used in the US unless it goes through that approval process. And I think we need to carry through our decisions on Huawei and ZTE with respect to federal dollars and apply it to our equipment authorization regime so we close that loophole that allows these insecure devices to continue to get inserted into the US communications network. I also think we need to take a second step, and that's the other idea that I'm going to throw out there today, which is we need to adopt measures to ensure devices made with forced labor do not enter the US market. There's longstanding general rules that prohibit goods made with slave labor generally from entering the US market. Senator Rubio and others in Congress have gotten together on a bipartisan basis and have introduced legislation to strengthen that existing prohibition. I think it's very clear that we aren't doing enough. And when you step back and you look at the genocide that is taking place in Xinjiang right now, there's a number of studies that look at this, and including at least one that points to the potential for slave labor to have been used in the supply chain of a US company. It's not enough for all of us to sort of wait around and see what happens. I think it's incumbent on all of us to take some action. So what I think we need to do is we need to look at that same equipment authorization process that the FCC has. And again, this is a process that applies to any electronic device that comes into the US market. And we should strengthen the safeguards to make sure that when companies seek to apply to get their electronic devices approved by the FCC and therefore approved to be used in the US, that we apply a heightened review to make sure there is not any forced labor there, particularly devices that are tied back to Xinjiang. So I think we need to track the approach put forward by Senator Rubio and a bipartisan group of senators. That was a bill on the House side, at least, that passed through the House during last Congress. I think the CCP is very plainly committing genocide and crimes against humanity in Xinjiang. And so we need to take a more FCC without waiting for that bill to pass through Congress and start a proceeding that would look at how we use our equipment authorization process to make sure that type of forced labor isn't in the supply chain. Relatedly, Communist China has made clear that it wants to dominate the global market for semiconductors and chipsets. And there's certainly no reason to think that they will not refrain from using forced labor in pursuing that goal. So I think this is yet another reason why we must require companies to be more vigilant, not to look the other way, and to take additional actions across their own supply chains to make sure that we're not supporting Communist China's human rights abuses, that they're not profiting from those practices by the production of chipsets or really any other electronic devices that we at the FCC ultimately review and approve. With that, I'm happy to turn to the rest of the panelists for their remarks. And I'm happy to engage more directly on these two ideas that I've thrown out. Closing this loophole so that we have no devices that get into our networks, regardless of the source of funding, that we've already determined to be a national security risk, and that we apply a heightened review to make sure that we're not allowing any devices from garage door openers to network gears to cell phones that we review and approve at the FCC, that we are making sure that the companies that are submitting these applications are doing even more work to make sure that forced labor is not involved.
This is a very topical issue, and I've actually been thinking about it in light of recent Chinese actions to push back against companies that have taken a position on these issues. So we'll have a good discussion. Nuri, can I ask you to make some remarks then after the commissioner?
Yes. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank CSIS for organizing this event and inviting me to be part of this important conversation that we should have more often. My name is Nuri Turkel. I'm a commissioner at the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. USCIRF is a bipartisan independent legislative branch agency that makes recommendations to the President, Secretary of State, and Congress on ways to advance freedom of religion and belief worldwide. We have 9 commissioners appointed by the majority and minority party leaders in Congress, and also President of the United States, whose work supported by 20 staff members at the commission. What am I doing here? Why my commission is interested in this issue? This is one of the ways that the technology specifically is one of the ways in which the Chinese Communist Party has been successfully carrying out the ongoing genocidal campaign that Commissioner Carr eloquently described to us. Today's topic on China telecom firms and forced labor, Uyghur forced labor, the implications of their intersection with the US national security is certainly a timely one. China's brutal domestic oppression of ethnic and religious minorities and its overexpanding influence abroad presents an inseparable security and human rights challenge to the United States and to our international partners and allies, which rightly warrants immediate attention and action on part of the Biden administration and US allies. I argue that both security and human rights are integral part of the US national security interest, and we must address them as such as we counter the China challenge. The reality is that it is rather difficult to separate the two, especially when it comes to Chinese telecom companies like Huawei and ZTE, which presents simultaneously a security and human rights threat to the United States. As many of you know, China's digital authoritarianism and Uyghur forced labor are two key means through which the Chinese Communist Party used to oppress the Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims that have been widely reported in the media. While the international community and the US government, including my own agency, have paid significant attention to foreign companies' complicity in this regard, we must also zero in on Chinese companies' role in the horrific human rights abuses committed against the Uyghurs. And this has been expanding. Last year, my commission held a hearing. One of the witnesses told us that the digital authoritarianism is metastasizing and now have been adopted over 80 countries around the world. First of all, we must also, let me go over why we have to focus on these issues. First of all, we must be aware that the Chinese technology companies, including telecom, are not independent. They often have intimate ties to the Chinese Communist Party, with party branches deeply embedded in their corporate structure. Huawei, for example, has several hundred CCP committees. When needed, these Chinese companies will uphold the party's leadership and carry out the party's policy in their business operations. Additionally, these companies also have key actors in promoting China's internet governance model internationally as a new norm. If left unchecked, China will become an internet superpower that is able to shape the standards and norms of the global internet, a trend of enormous implications for US national security interests and world stability. Second, when it comes to China's digital authoritarianism, Chinese telecom companies like Huawei and ZTE have long played a vital role in facilitating and implementing China's oppressive policies in the Uyghur and Tibetan regions. Huawei is a key provider of sophisticated surveillance technologies used in Xinjiang, including facial recognition. It also provides technical support and training to Xinjiang Public Security Bureau, which has been added to Commerce Department's entity list. And alarmingly, Huawei has been exporting its surveillance technology solutions called Smart Cities projects abroad to countries with poor human rights records, such as Venezuela, Zimbabwe, where oppressive regimes can use these technologies to persecute human rights activists and political opponents. And finally, Chinese telecom companies like Huawei and ZTE, along with other well-known Chinese tech companies such as Lenovo, Hisense, iFlyTech, and Xiaomi, have been complicit in the use of Uyghur forced labor in their supply chains. Forced labor abuses involving these technology companies mostly occur in involuntary and exploitative labor transfer programs in which Uyghurs were transferred from Xinjiang to work at suppliers' factories in eastern province of China. So when they said, oh, we're going to stop the forced labor practice in Xinjiang, doesn't mean that this problem can be solved, because they can relocate it and use it and do it in other places in China. There's one example that has been in the news a lot, the case of Ofilm, a supplier for Chinese telecom and tech giants Lenovo and Huawei, where the Uyghur workers have been involuntarily recruited and perform forced labor in a fortified compound with security cameras and guards at the entrance. Their movement is severely restricted, and they're not allowed to pray or engage in any religious worship activities. In conclusion, I'd like to note that China's telecom industry presents both human rights and security challenges to the United States and the world at large. China's telecom companies' complicity in Uyghur forced labor and digital authoritarianism threatens human rights both in China and abroad. China could exploit its pioneer status in emerging technologies forming artificial intelligence, quantum computing to 5G networks, to influence how the technologies are developed and used, as well as to shape the standards and norms associated with these technologies. China is, in fact, leveraging its economic, geopolitical influence over countries where its technologies are deployed to its own advantage and to undermine democracy and threaten human rights worldwide, to engage in espionage, intellectual property theft, and military aggression. And I appreciate today's opportunity for me to share the human rights aspect of Chinese tech authoritarianism and the and misuse of that advantages to threaten democratic norms and civil liberties around the world.
Thank you, Nuri. I should note that this is clearly a good topic because we've already gotten a lot of questions from the audience. We'll come to them after we hear from Dean. So Dean, please, could you offer us a few remarks?
Yes, thank you to CSIS for the opportunity to be here this afternoon. My comments are going to be a little bit more on the Chinese policy aspects that are influencing both what Commissioner Carr and Nuri Turkel were just talking about. I think it's important to begin by recognizing that China sees the world as entering a new period, that the world has shifted from the industrial age to the information age. Because from the Chinese Communist Party's perspective, what that means is information is now the currency of power, both domestic and foreign. Notice that I don't use the term cyber, because it's not just about the bits and bytes, the software, hacking, viruses. It is about information. And from the Chinese government's perspective, it is about controlling the generation, the transmission, the access to the exploitation, the interpretation, and the credibility of information. And this is both internal and external implications. When we look at the Chinese domestic information environment, it's important to recognize, again, the foremost PRC priority, CCP priority, Chinese Communist Party priority, is to keep itself in power. This is an authoritarian government that brooks no real opposition. So in the domestic context, the issue is how can China use information to essentially help monitor 1.3 billion people? And the CCP recognizes that the vast majority of these people, frankly, have no particular position or opinion. They are not out to overthrow the government, not necessarily particularly enthusiastically supporting the government either, but that it is winnowing through that 1.3 billion people to the key elements that might oppose it, whether it is certain ethnic minorities, whether it is human rights activists more broadly, whether it is people who are unhappy about consumer product safety or corruption. How do you get at that? And so the Chinese have demonstrated a very comprehensive approach domestically. And this is reflected in the social credit scoring system that you may have read about. This ties together all sorts of information, your medical records, your internet searches, your banking records, your how well you do paying off your credit cards, your internet searches, where you eat, where you are working, the geolocation on your cell phones. All of this data is tied together so that the Chinese surveillance system can build a remarkably comprehensive picture of people down to the individual level, should they need it. And here, what we see is that Chinese internet service providers, hardware manufacturers, software designers, all of these can be made to comply with Chinese law. And part of this goes to the reality that in the Chinese system, there is no civil society. There's nothing beyond the reach of the CCP. So whether you are a state-owned enterprise or whether you're a private company, as Nuri Turkel noted, those companies nonetheless are penetrated or have party committees that oversee every aspect, every operation. And this comprehensive approach, coupled with what the Chinese term ABC, artificial intelligence, big data, and cloud computing, allows them to manage this huge pool of data that they have collected in order to maintain surveillance over this population. The same approach is then applied internationally. Chinese information monitoring and surveillance serves multiple functions. And again, the highest priority is keeping the CCP in power. So on the one hand, this includes the typical espionage aspects of trying to find out other people's military secrets, your war plans, your fighter aircraft designs, your transportation plans. But in addition to that is monitoring what the Chinese would consider anti-China elements. Now, whether that is the Tibetan government in exile and Uyghur dissidents abroad, or organizations that advocate religious freedom, or whether it is simply groups that oppose the CCP, what China has demonstrated is that to them, these are all of a piece. They are all targets, they all must be penetrated. And this is an ongoing effort. When Google first tried to go into China and set up servers in Hong Kong, and for a while there was a google.cn domain, what they found was something called Project Aurora, that the Chinese under Project Aurora were trying to penetrate the Google email servers because they wanted access to Tibetan and other dissident emails, to find out who was talking to whom, who was communicating, what the chains were, who was funding. This goes to the reality that the Chinese are constantly trying to gain intelligence on a variety of topics. It's very holistic because it's never quite clear where a line can be drawn between military issues, economic issues, political issues, diplomatic issues. And so we see the Chinese engaging in essentially the almost hoovering up data on all sorts of groups, people, organizations. They want to know not only who is in an organization, but how that chain of command works, how items are coordinated, so that they can then go and attack the links as well as the individuals in the organizations. And part of the purpose of this is the Chinese concept of what we would call deterrence, what they term 威慑, which is really coercion. That if you know that your emails are being monitored, if you are pretty sure, or can't be certain, how secure your communications are, then you may be more reticent. You may choose not to write things. You may choose not to email things. And from the Chinese perspective, that's all to the good. It's not that they necessarily, that you have to agree with them, it's that you shut up. And so in that regard, what we see then is the Chinese information monitoring and control, which goes beyond what some of you may have seen about the Great Firewall of China. It's not just about keeping adversarial or negative information out. Certainly that's something they want to do, but it's also getting access to other people's information that they would prefer to keep secure. One of the key things that rarely is talked about for some reason is the border gateway protocol hack that the Chinese have done. To hyper grossly oversimplify, essentially, the Chinese have used their positions, their physical location of China Telecom, state-owned, highest level telecom company in North America, to essentially redirect chunks of the global internet to China. And it goes in and it eventually comes out the other side. But you can be pretty sure that the Chinese have probably recorded a lot of that for future breakdown, decryption, and exploitation. I mean, we're talking percentages of the global internet and internet traffic being deliberately redirected. This gives you a sense of the scale and the near pathological need to find out everyone else's information. This is one of the reasons why Huawei is a challenge, because if Huawei produces the hardware for internet servicing, then in that case, what we are looking at is all of this data is passing over physical servers and routers so that you can potentially redirect things almost automatically. So let me conclude here by noting that the PRC challenge when it comes to information, whether it's about surveillance, whether it's about information about dissidents, whether it is about intellectual property, is a holistic one driven by the view that information is the key to modern national power. This focus on information goes beyond bits, bytes, viruses, malware, Trojan horses, to hardware, software, and apps. It touches on aspects such as space, because so much information transits across space or is gathered from space, as well as terrestrial aspects. And monitoring and surveillance is a global, not just Chinese local phenomenon, and it is aimed at any and all who might challenge the continued dominance of the CCP. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Dean. It sounds like we're in violent agreement, which you might think would mean it's going to be the easy session, but we've gotten more than a dozen questions while people were talking. So let me start working through the list. And the first one might be for you, Commissioner Carr. What's the reaction been to your proposals? What do people say? I mean, are there obstacles? Are there people who are reluctant? Tell us what the reaction has been, please.
Well, pieces of this idea I included back in 2019 when the commission was looking for further comment on removing what we call subsidized, that's a shorthand we use, subsidized Huawei ZTE gear, meaning subsidized by federal dollars. When we were looking at that, I said, let's include in there seeking comment on getting this gear out, regardless of where the source of funding is. So there's been some record developed on that, and we'll see where it goes. You know, traditionally, I think people have viewed the equipment authorization process at the FCC as a sort of fairly technical process, right? Sort of what spectrum does this work at? What power levels does it work at? But I think given the fact that, you know, we've used our universal service dollars authority to go at Huawei and ZTE so far, I think it makes perfect sense to look at updating our approach to the equipment authorization process, and at least in these unique circumstances, inserting there, you know, carrying through the USF decisions into our OET process, and then also adding to it this check for forced labor. So I think it would require the FCC as a full commission to seek comment on this, have a robust debate, and then move forward. But I obviously think, you know, we should be heading in this direction.
Great, thank you. Let me ask a question to the whole group, which is in the last week or two, we've seen China retaliate by calling out companies that have taken actions against them, by sanctioning individuals. I think all of us were probably a little disappointed that we weren't sanctioned, but in the face of this Chinese pushback, how would you respond? What would you do back to the Chinese commissioner? I don't know if you want to start, or we can start with Nuri or Dean, but the Chinese have clearly decided, we know the names of the companies, calls for boycotts on their social media, sanctioning of think tanks and private citizens in Europe and the US. What would you do back?
Since my fellow commissioners were sanctioned over the weekend, maybe I should comment. It appears that our strategy has been working on two fronts. One, calling them out, public education, and showing that this is a bipartisan concern for the United States and American people. Not only that the Chinese technology, surveillance techniques have been threatening the international norms, democratic systems, and also it is creating a sovereignty concern. They are right here using that very technology to threaten, harass American citizens, and posing, creating the anxiety and fearfulness here at home among our fellow citizens. So my two commissioners, Chairwoman Gail Manchin and Vice Chair Tony Perkins, were sanctioned over the weekend, and I can tell that even though we are International Religious Freedom Commission, we've been focused on this issue because this particular techniques have been used by the Chinese authority and also China's allies or friends, supporters, for religious and human rights abuses, religious persecution and human rights abuses. So we hold hearing. We've been writing, speaking on these issues. So apparently we got their attention, and also this is a sign of desperation in Chinese attempt to try to change the narrative, try to turn this into whataboutism, trying to call the United States or objective professionals who have training and knowledge on this as liars. So when you have nothing to say, when you're cornered, this is what they do. What you do? Bring up, play the whataboutism game, and calling others liars. So this is what is happening in my mind. So what we need to do is exactly what the Biden administration is doing: push back with our partners and allies. This is, end of the day, is a global concern. In the past, during the Trump era, Chinese successfully promoted anything against China's technology as part of Trump's China policy, but this has become bipartisan issue now. And Secretary Blinken was right in saying in his confirmation hearing that he wants to focus on two things: forced labor, and stop our technology going out to China to either wittingly or unwittingly facilitate the ongoing genocidal campaign. Even though those things have been already in the works, I was pleased on my personal capacity, an official capacity, that the Biden administration is prioritizing these issues, rightfully so.
Yeah, I'll simply pick up there and add, there's nothing that a communist likes less than hearing the truth spoken freely. So I think it's a great sign that there is bipartisan agreement here, including through the Biden administration, on the atrocities and the genocide that we're seeing in Xinjiang. And I think it's incumbent on all of us. Look, for decades we've always said never again when it comes to this type of activities that we're now seeing in Xinjiang, and yet here we are again. And so I think we need to all of us speak up. I think we make sure companies that are sourcing materials from that region need to be held to a higher bar. I think that's what the Rubio bill would do. I think that's why we need to track that at the FCC. And obviously, I think Nuri brings a lot of an authoritative voice here. He hasn't shared his personal story, but I think people that know his background or have read his bio can understand the very sort of valuable personal perspective that he brings to these issues.
Thank you.
I think that to build off of both the previous statements. First off, I think that the idea of the Democracy Summit that President Biden has floated offers an excellent opportunity for like-minded countries to signal Beijing that its behavior has gotten our attention and is something that is not going to simply pass by. Whether it is prohibiting slave labor-produced items, whether from being sold, whether it is demanding more transparency with regards to the treatment of Uyghurs, Tibetans, other dissidents in China, a group of nations enunciating this will be absolutely more powerful than just the United States saying that alone. And so I certainly hope that this would be one of the issues that would be on that agenda. One of the things that we should keep in mind is that Chinese companies have been able to list on the American stock exchanges with not even all of the financial disclosures typically required of American companies under Sarbanes-Oxley. This was an agreement reached quietly between the United States and China around 2014 or 2015, if I remember correctly. Clearly, that should be revoked. And one of the things that probably should be required, certainly of Chinese companies, but perhaps more broadly, is certification that you are not knowingly, certainly, engaging in the purchase and use of forced labor products. I do want to point out one source of concern with these sanctions, with these various declarations by the Chinese. We assume that really this is the Chinese would do this, and so if you do not go to China, then if members of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom don't go to China, then they are going to be safe. But keep in mind that China has, through its Belt and Road Initiative, built ties to an enormous number of countries. And just as Canada was willing to step in and detain Meng Wanzhou, the CFO for Huawei, on American charges, there is now the distinct possibility that Americans, commissioners, government officials, or even private officials, when they are transiting some third country that is a heavy recipient of Chinese funding, and keep in mind, this isn't just Central Asia, this is Africa, this is the Middle East, this is Central and South America, this is even Europe, could potentially suddenly find themselves being detained to be handed over to Chinese authorities because China just provided a multi-billion-dollar telecommunications network or pipeline network or built a port. So China has the real ability with these sanctions, with these warrants, to reach out and touch Americans on a scale that we have not seen before, back during the Cold War and certainly during the post-Cold War days.
So a number of questions that we've gotten, and we continue to get questions, revolve around the issue of how do we work with other countries? How do we build coalitions? How do we perhaps come up with common standards for the use of telecommunications equipment? How do we work to close loopholes? And, one of the questions even went to say, if a device is in transit from China to the US, how do we ensure that it isn't tampered with en route? So I think a focus for many of the people in the audience has been, what's the role with other countries? Where do we find ways to cooperate with them in moving ahead? So I don't know who wants to start. Commissioner, do you want to start on that?
If you look back a couple of years ago when we started our efforts at the FCC and otherwise, the State Department was very active in the U.S. They engaged in this approach called the Clean Networks approach, and we engaged a lot, particularly with our counterparts in Europe. And at first, people, even some people inside the U.S., said that America is going it alone. We're pitching everyone on banning Huawei, but no one is following suit. But the State Department and the FCC leadership at the time kept at it, and lo and behold, the tide turned. And now you see Europe and countries there taking a much tougher approach, aligning themselves with the U.S. So I think the State Department efforts with the Clean Networks approach has been successful. We need to keep engaging. As you said, this is a Belt and Road initiative. I've been in Africa myself. I've been, a couple hour drive down a bumpy road outside of any major town. You get these small little communities, and there's Huawei banners all over the place. And so they're playing a very long game with respect to this Belt and Road initiative. And Huawei ZTE is the digital component of that. I think that's why also at the FCC we got to go and close this loophole, because we didn't go around the world telling people that this Clean Network initiative, keep Huawei and ZTE gear out, provided that your country's federal dollars aren't involved. We did the right thing, which is you got to get this stuff out, and that's why we need to hold ourselves now to that exact same standard moving forward and close this loophole.
If I may, James, this is an interesting question. Yeah, we're seeing some positive development, multilateral in nature, but we have not heard from the tech companies yet. I think a part of the effort should be taking this matter from the situation room to the boardroom. Why the technology firms are still either feigning ignorance or not doing anything. And we do know it very well that even U.S. government imposes various measures, adding them to the entity list and provide protection, as the excellent point that Dean was making, to protect our government officials travel to some countries. If the Silicon Valley does not step up to the plate, the Chinese can manipulate, they can change the names, they can use their own ways to bypass sanctions or any measures that our government or our partners take. So this has to be tackled as part of the governmental effort in the company level. The engineers, for example, have a huge role to play. If the engineers resist, especially in our tech firms, then the upper management will start paying attention, because those engineers, those talent are not replaceable. They're not easily replaceable. They're not someone they can train overnight or with a 1 or 2 year extensive training. So this has to be societal, governmental, and business collaborated effort. This is it's easy for me to say it, and people may think, oh, this guy happened to be Uyghur, he can just exaggerate as much as he wants. But I'm saying it as from the human perspective. This is a serious matter that everyone should be screaming from the rooftop.
Is exactly right there. I think corporate America has been far too silent for far too long on this issue. Silence, as far as I can tell, principally because they want to maintain access to a market of a billion plus people. There's a new organization representing a lot of these Silicon Valleys launching in DC, I think right now, called the self-stylized as the Chamber of Progress. I think a great first step for that type of an organization would be to speak out against the Uyghur genocide and take a tough stance on forced labor.
Forgive me if I'm rather pessimistic about big tech. I mean, this is the big tech whose engineers certainly were willing to speak up at Google, for example, and say, we do not want to participate in American government activities like Project Maven. But for the longest time had no qualms whatsoever about helping China develop its own search engines under Project Dragonfly, which would conveniently censor an awful lot of results if the Chinese government didn't particularly like them. So I am not holding my breath for big tech to speak up. That being said, I do think that with the trade war between the United States and China, and a number of companies and countries more broadly looking to reset supply chains, really a bifurcated supply chain now, one going to the United States, one going to China, or in many cases, I suspect, one going to China, one going to the rest of the world. There is an opportunity to extend the clean network concept. Because if you're going to start from scratch, if you're going to build new supply facilities in Indonesia or Mexico, then you can try to, at least from the get-go for these facilities, then have chain of custody, have monitoring, of where are items coming from and where are they going to basically try and at least have some transparency and insight into your work. It's not perfect, obviously. There's always an opportunity to get in and mess with the system. But I do think that the irony is that this trade war that has done some resetting of global trade directions, coupled with COVID, of course, does offer a potential opportunity moving forward.
We're down to about the last 10 minutes or so and have a ton of questions. Let me break them into two categories that might be easier to respond to. The first set of questions is building on the proposals that Commissioner Carr made. What are the next steps for the US, both internationally on clean networks, domestically on the work in improving, closing the loopholes, as you put it? What is the next set of things the US needs to do to improve the security of its telecommunications networks? Commissioner, I don't know if you want to, that's sort of a softball for you, I hope. I don't know if you want to pick it up.
No, we're proceeding on a couple fronts. Back in 2018, when I put this idea out there that we seek comment on rip and replace, that's taking the Huawei, ZTE, other insecure gear out of the network. We're now doing that. In fact, Congress just funded those efforts. We denied the application of China Mobile, which came up earlier, to enter the US market. And at the time, I called for the FCC to do a top to bottom review of every carrier that has received authority in the past to connect to the US network. And we are now engaging in that process of looking at whether we should revoke those authorizations. As Dean mentioned earlier, we've seen that evidence in our record, for instance, of a carrier with ties to communist China that took traffic data that was originating in California, destined for Washington, D.C., and through Guangzhou, China. And the California, Guangzhou, Washington, D.C. route is probably not the most efficient way that you would direct traffic, matter. So we're engaging in all of that. And I think, these next two steps in terms of carrying through our decisions to all equipment, regardless of funding, and looking at the forced labor issues for our OET are going to be two of the important steps going forward. The other one I'll add out there is, we're engaged in this process looking at what's called ORAN, which is sort of virtualized software-defined networks. We think that's an opportunity for a lot of US-based companies to compete, where previously you had to be a multi-billion-dollar entity like Huawei or ZTE to enter the sort of equipment space in the 5G market.
Great, yeah. And I noticed that there's a number of Chinese companies that are interested in ORAN. When you talk to some of them, they'll say, well, they're not eager to see Huawei become a monopoly either, just for price reasons. So the move in technology is really interesting. The second set of questions revolves around China's own plans. We got a question on how does what we're talking about fit in with the 5-year plan. We've brought up the Belt and Road Initiative many times and gotten several questions on that. Where do you see, and this might be a good place for Dean and Nuri to start, what's the long term here? I mean, what are the Chinese thinking? What do we need to do to build on Commissioner Carr's proposals? But what's the planning behind all this?
So let me take a first quick cut at this. Made in China 2025 laid out 10 key technology areas that China openly said, we do not want to depend on the rest of the world for these technologies. It included microchip manufacturing, but it also included a lot of fairly, what we would consider anodyne technologies, railway technology, agricultural machinery. Why this matters is because this plan was published in 2015. Anyone who has worked in bureaucracy knows something large like this doesn't just spring up overnight. So the Chinese were already thinking about how to essentially recreate mercantilism, where they sell to the rest of the world, but they don't buy from the rest of the world, other than perhaps certain raw materials. Beginning in 2013 or 2014, this was not about Donald Trump. This was not about the current trade war. This is something the Chinese started thinking about at this point over 8 years ago. Going forward, we see something called China Standards 2035. In a nutshell, China wants to help write standards for a variety of products that will have global impact, partly so that Chinese goods cannot be kept out of markets, but also in the area of things like information protection, that you wind up with lower standards so that China can more easily break in. All of this is to say the Chinese have a very long-term plan. It isn't 1 year or 2 years. This is going forward at least out to 2035. And it is about, again, securing information dominance while also paying attention to key industrial technologies so that China can basically insulate itself from foreign economic pressures, supply chain pressures, but do the same thing, impose pressures, influence supply chain on other parties.
Nuri, do you want to add to that?
I'm good. Let's go to the next question.
Okay, we have a couple more. Some people are asking, is bifurcation of the global economy then inevitable? Is it going to be two camps? Is decoupling gradual? How fast will it be? So what are your views on bifurcation? The inevitability of it is a hard one because this is driven in a good measure by Chinese behavior. And that makes it hard to see how we get out of this. But maybe you could talk about your views on decoupling and bifurcation.
No, you're right. When people criticizing the Trump administration China policy, they forgot that in early on, Trump administration actually wanted to work with the Chinese. Their behavior, their conducts, their influence operations around the world, even at home, resulted in that response. So I think decoupling is inevitable because it's not only illegal, it's unethical for the American consumers continue to export tainted products from China. There have been a report that we as a country rely on China for more than 80 critical products. That includes PPEs being exported to the United States and made through forced labor. So the United States has to take a hard look at the supply chain issues to either to relocate it to somewhere else, another country that can be following international labor standards, or bring it back home. So it's inevitable, and also because of the ongoing discussion, media scrutiny, we're seeing a growing concern in the United States Congress. So I reasonably anticipate that United States government, particularly Congress, will put in place additional legal tools, measures, or resources. As we speak at the CBP, there are about 15 government officials investigate the potentially tainted products. Considering the amount of product coming to the United States and that little team is untenable. And also based on CSIS's report done by Amy Lair in 2019, 2020, last year, during the period of April 2019 through April 20, the export volume from Xinjiang to the United States increased nearly 250%. During the same period, the export volume from Xinjiang to Italy increased by nearly 200%. That can give you a kind of idea how serious this problem is. So this is not something that we can ignore anymore.
Great. Dean, do you want to add anything? The numbers are astounding, 250%.
There was interesting, Wall Street Journal op-ed over the weekend by Matt Pottinger, who covered these issues in the White House the last couple of years. And he talked there about, targeted decoupling as opposed to wholesale decoupling as being, something not only on the table, but something that we have to pursue, particularly in the tech sector.
Yeah, it turns out to be really complicated. We've done a lot of work at CSIS on semiconductors. And I think one of the things that's changed is that, companies now see political risk and they're seeking to shield themselves by diversifying out of China. The issue is that fast enough for the problems we face? Let me see, since we're at the witching hour, if any of you would like to make any final remarks on this topic. We covered a lot of ground. It's a big subject, but I can tell from the volume of questions, holy cow, we've got even more while I was talking. I can tell from the volume of questions that this was a timely discussion. Final remarks from anyone? Oh.
From my perspective at the FCC, I think, the steps that have been taken, frankly, on a bipartisan basis the last couple of years are the right ones, and we need to build on it from there. I mean, the threats posed by communist China or communist regimes in general, I think is one that most people are most familiar with cracking open, dusty foreign policy magazines and reading about. And I think particularly over the last year and a half or so, that's changed. It's now a kitchen table conversation for so many Americans for a variety of reasons. And I think it's one that we need to continue to pursue. And again, maintaining our focus on, the oppressive Communist Party itself, while holding up the people of China, the Uyghurs, as people that we are advocating for, defending, and supporting, and making sure that we're always careful with our words to draw that important distinction.
I'd like to add that on a genocide question, please understand that it was a bipartisan decision made by Secretary Pompeo, endorsed by Antony Blinken. So talking more about it, trying to opine it, trying to make it a subject for law review articles would only help the CCP to continue its genocidal campaign. It only helps them to buy more time. It only helps the good faith conversation being injected into the official propaganda. So be very, very careful when you criticize the US government for that determination. Only in our history since the United States ratified the Geneva Convention in 1988, similar decision has been made only 5 times, number 6, the Uyghur genocide. And the United States government does not and cannot just casually designate any country for committing genocide. We're talking about world's 2nd largest economy. It's not a matter of joke. So those people who are trying to engage in good faith, quote unquote, conversation, as the Economist magazine did, be careful. Your good faith conversation, your disagreement with the United States government may be misused by Beijing for propaganda campaign.
Yeah, one of the points I make to European and Asian audiences is this is an issue on which Americans are united, not only in the Congress, but if you look at the public opinion polls among the population at large. So the example I usually use is the CHIPS Act, 94-6. When was the last time you saw something like that? So we are moving towards a unified position on China. We're developing the tools to deal with it. Commissioner Carr, thank you for your work in moving this forward. We've got a lot more to do. And so let me thank our panelists, Commissioner Brendan Carr, Dean Chong, and Nuri Turkel. We'll have the recorded version of this up available on the CSIS website. I apologize to the many people whose questions I was unable to get to, but thank you all for listening in. Thank you to the panelists, and talk to you soon.